Okay. Guys ready? Here we go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Housing and Redevelopment Authority meeting for the City of Edina. It is Thursday, September 15th, 2022. And before we call the roll and call the meeting to order, I wanted to make sure that everyone understood that we are doing and continuing to do our meetings either at the City Council level or the HRA level on a hybrid basis. Today, if you are watching on one of the devices that you're able to watch on and one of the systems you're able to watch on, the only time you'll be able to participate in the meeting is during community comment. If you want to participate in community comment, here's the 800 number on the screen, 888-504-7949, the conference ID 418-394. Press star 1 to speak to the operator, and that operator will bring you into Director Benarott, who will bring you into the HRA. And you'll have 3 minutes to tell us what's on your mind and what you're concerned about. So we'll get to community comment in just a couple of moments. And now I'm going to call the meeting to order and ask Liz Olson, our Administrative Support Specialist, to call the roll.
Commissioner Jackson. Here. Commissioner Anderson.
Here.
Commissioner Pierce.
Here.
Chair Hovland.
Here. Now let's do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And now we've got the meeting agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to modify the meeting agenda in any way? Staff? We're good? All right. Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda as published?
So moved.
Second.
We got a motion and a second to approve the meeting agenda. Motion by Commissioner Jackson, second by Commissioner Anderson to approve the meeting agenda as published. Any further discussion? All those in favor of approving the meeting agenda say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. And now we are at community comment. Again, that number is 888-504-7949. Participant code 418394. Press star 1 on your star 1 on your keypad to speak to an operator. That operator will bring you into Director Benarott, who will bring you into the HRA. Director Benarott, do we have anybody on the line who wants to speak to us today? And for those that are calling in, just a reminder that you cannot talk to us about something that's on the agenda today or scheduled for a future public hearing. So with those two qualifiers, do we have anybody on the line?
I do not yet have anyone on the line. Because there is a slight delay with the broadcast, I'd recommend that we wait 1 minute before moving on. My clock shows it at 7:35. I will come back to you at 7:36 or when I have a caller, whichever is first.
Thank you.
I still don't have a caller, so I think it's safe for you to move on.
All right. Thank you, Director Benarott. And then usually following community comment, we have our executive director's response to community comments that were made at the prior meeting. I don't think we had any.
We did not.
And so our executive director, Scott Neal, who also happens to be our city manager, has nothing to report there. We've got a consent agenda with several items on it. Is there anyone on the HRA that wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? Hearing nothing, is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Member Jackson, second, or Commissioner Jackson, second by Commissioner Pierce, that we adopt the consent agenda as published. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adoption of the consent agenda items in a single motion say aye. 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 Opposed? Carried. And then we are going to move on now to the heart of the meeting, which is our reports and recommendations section of the meeting. We've got a couple of items we want to cover here, and our Bill Neundorf, our Economic Development Manager, has the first matter, and that is a discussion on a proposed update on our tax increment financing policy. Two interesting discussions this morning. Welcome, Manager Neundorf.
Your Honor, if I could give you a quick tee up for this.
Sure, yes, go ahead.
We had, as we do with the HRA meetings, we do some planning ahead, and because we want to cancel them if we don't have content for you, and we want to cancel them and give you enough advance notice of that so that you can do something else with this time. We've decided today to pursue a kind of a policy discussion meeting with you because we have these two large subjects that we are constantly having discussions both at the staff level and at the commission and council level. And we want to propose and have some discussion around some changes to these kind of fundamental policies. I want to tell you, you're at the very front end of this process. So both Mr. Neundorf and Ms. Hawkinson have put together their thoughts on how they think we ought to proceed, but we want to get your feedback before we do anything with ordinances or anything more serious than this. So that's what's in front of you today.
All right, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Morning.
Good
Morning,
morning. Bill Neundorf, the city's Economic Development Manager. So the policy proposal we have in front of you today is an update on our TIF policy. And in your packet, there's about a 6-page red line that's fairly dense. I put a summary together in a few slides to kind of talk to the higher level issues. What I'd like to do this morning is give you an overview for about 10 minutes, and then I'd love your input and direction to proceed. Today, we're not looking for any particular action, but instead I'm hoping to get your direction. The city last updated our TIF policy in 2011. It served us well, but as we have more and more complex and complicated projects, staff thinks it's valuable to have some clarifying statements in the policy. Statements that will help clarify the use of TIF to developers, to their architects and financial people. I think even more importantly, to add clarity to the residents of Edina that sometimes have concerns and sometimes misperceptions about TIF. So I'll walk through those in just a moment here. In summary, though, I've got a couple historical slides together here. So this map shows the current tax increment financing districts that are in Edina. We currently have 11 districts. They're all relatively small. They're shown in blue on this map. And then historically, Edina's used TIF since the 1980s. Edinburgh Park was the first project that we used TIF on, and then Centennial Lakes. So we leveraged the tax increment financing on those projects to deliver some private investment in Edina, as well as some tremendous public assets and public benefits. So each of these yellow dots are just the approximate location of past TIF districts, about a dozen that have expired several years ago, but just wanted to put that on there for context. And today, this chart, you've seen it before. We update this every time we consider a new TIF district. This is a comparison of how much of a community's tax base is included in a TIF district. So these are Hennepin County communities, some that are near to us geographically, others that are similar to us in demographics or in size or in population. And if you see it, if you look to the far right, Edina is the green line. Currently, 1.1% of our total tax base is included in a TIF district. We're at the almost the extreme low end of the range. There's not a right percentage or a wrong percentage. It's just a decision that's made by communities as far as how to finance some investments in their community. And historically, Edina's typically been on the low end. I think at our peak, when the Southdale district was still active, we were at about 4 or 5%. But we've always been on that lower end of the range. So the proposed revisions to the policy have 4 primary goals, and these are all clarification in nature. There's No radical change that's being proposed or intense change. But number one, to clarify the intent and purpose of when we consider and when we use TIF. Also to clarify the minimum expectations when TIF is used. The third is to clarify the process and the timing. And the fourth is a proposal to update our application fee. Our fee is currently $2,000. We haven't changed that since 2011. And as Ms. Hawkinson and I have done a lot of these conversations in recent years, I can tell you we're spending a lot more time than $2,000 worth. So the first category, clarifying the intent and the purpose. Historically, Edina has used TIF to create public benefit. Public benefit that is unusual in nature. Public parking, public space, public sidewalks, trails, those types of things. Edina is in a very fortunate economic situation where we do not have to use TIF for every project, and we don't use TIF for every project. But it's helpful to define what public benefit could mean. So I'm proposing to add a definition of that. The definition is broad because one thing with TIF is that every project is different. Every project on every site in every economic climate is different. So we definitely need some flexibility. We don't want to tie our hands unnecessarily, but we want to be clear about what our goals are. So the proposal would also confirm that TIF is used in exceptional situations. Some developers and some residents think that we're giving away millions in TIF to every single project. As you know, that is not the case. Has never been. I don't think it ever will be. But I'm suggesting we actually put that in writing to make it clear that, if your goal is to provide the bare minimum as far as satisfying our code and regulatory requirements, it's probably not going to be a TIF eligible project. Also, to limit the amount of TIF to the value of those public benefits. We've discussed from time to time a percentage. What's the right percentage of TIF? Is it 10%? Is it 5%? Is it 20%? There's no magic number. Sometimes we use 10 as a general rule of thumb, 10%. I'm very hesitant to put that in writing, though, because the minute we say we're going to cap it at 10%, every developer that comes in is going to ask for 9.9%. If they only need 3, let's talk about 3%. So I'm very hesitant to actually put a formal number in there, but instead to tie the use of TIF to the public value that we receive. One of the things we traditionally do is also limit the developer's profitability and their fees. So there's quite an extensive review of their pro formas, of their financial preparations for the projects, and we always make sure that the fees and the profits, and sometimes some of the hidden fees, there can be a broker fee, a development fee, a management fee. We need to look at those and make sure that they're a standard for the industry. We do that. We have, in my projects and Stephanie's projects, we've never not done that. But I'm suggesting let's put it in writing. We do it anyway. Let's make it clear that that is our standard procedure. And one of the other intentions here is to look at land values. So sometimes when TIF is used, some property owners will look at a TIF project and they come to a deduction that, the city used TIF for this project and that project, so that property sold for X million dollars. So if that's the case, I can ask more for my land when I sell it because the city will give them TIF and they'll put more money in my back pocket. It's not how it works. I think we should be clear about that. I've heard that concern from residents as well as, frankly, some property owners and some developers that are coming in thinking that if they have to pay an excessive amount for land, that's okay, the city will just make them whole. If there's public benefit, we should talk about it. If there's not, that's not a good use of TIF. My second goal here in these policy updates is clarifying our minimum expectations. In recent years, the city's adopted a lot of plans, a lot of policies. The Greater Southdale plans and all the design guidelines there, our sustainability plans, our affordable housing policies, My recommendation is that when TIF is used, we look at a project that doesn't meet the bare minimum of those policies, but that really satisfies the heart and intentions of those policies. One example is our sustainability policy, where we're aiming to get more projects that have design and certification as energy efficient projects. There's a whole slew of different ways to measure that. Each standard, whether it's lean or LEED or green buildings or B3 or Energy Star, there's a price tag attached with that. The policies that you've adopted in that realm are very solid, but if we're going to use TIF for a project, my recommendation is that we follow the intention of that policy. So if the intent is to have a LEED certified building, as an example, if we use TIF, let's make sure that building is LEED certified, not watered down to something that's less energy efficient but cheaper for the developer. Other things we've learned in recent years are the importance of having strong construction mitigation strategies. Where do the workers park when they're tearing the building down? What are the hours of operations? Do they talk to the neighbors? Do they give them advance notification? As the city's done some of our own projects, we learned through you and from you that that's a very important thing to the residents. My suggestion is that for a TIF project, since the city's financing is associated with that project, the developer do more than the bare minimum, that we actually ask them to show us their mitigation strategy, where they're going to park, hours, the routes of the big trucks, that type of thing. We don't have the ability, when we approve a project from a regulatory perspective, that's kind of off limits. But when we talk TIF, and now we're a financial partner, we can ask for a higher standard. So that's my recommendation to do that. The policy is not establishing the content of their mitigation strategy, but just saying that they must have one. They've got to work with staff to help develop it. And similarly, we've taken a similar approach for diversity and equity. The city has adopted some bold goals in the last couple of years in that realm. On the last couple tax increment projects that we've worked on, the one with Mortensen and Orion and the one with Reuter Walton, those developers were very willing to help us achieve those goals and provide greater employment for disadvantaged groups that aren't normally represented in the construction industry, as well as disadvantaged businesses, small contractors that might not get that first big job. They've been willing to say yes and try to make that work. So I'm suggesting we actually write that into our policy. Again, the policy statement in your packet is broad. I don't think it's appropriate at this time to define a certain percentage, because that changes over time. And certainly from project to project it might change. But I think at a minimum we should have that in our policy and make sure that it's a minimum expectation. Some of the other expectations all relate to the but-for. We talk about that a lot when we look at each individual deal. I'm just suggesting we actually put a little bit more meat in the policy about the but-for. We measure it on several occasions in the budget phase when they're first up here for review. When they finish the project and they actually have their final costs, we measure it again. And then when they sell the project, whether they sell it in 5 years, 15 years, 20 years, we measure it towards the end to make sure they needed the TIF. It's standard practice. We've done it on every deal. I'm suggesting that we actually write it down in our policy. And then finally, the final expectation I would have in my recommendations is the pursuit of grant funding. Certainly when the city uses TIF, we've put some of our financial backing behind the project. There's other programs out there from the state and Met Council and Hennepin County that I think as a minimum we should pursue those to leverage the city's investment with the developer's investment with compatible programs. No guarantee they'll get the grant, but I think it's my strong recommendation that we pursue the ones that are appropriate. And then the third major issue in the update is the process to review TIF. A lot of this comes to financing. Tax increment is typically the last money in, maybe the second money in, usually not the first money in. With some market rate developments, we've been asked to be the first money in. It seems like there should be equity in first, and they should have some better clarity on what their financing gap is, because that's really the intention of TIF, is to fill a financial gap. So if they're still playing with their equity and still playing with their debt, and I mean, they've got some general idea, but they haven't refined it, I think it's too early for us to make a TIF commitment. So the policy has a recommendation that when they're in for an application, we would notify you that they've submitted that application. If the application is incomplete, I don't think we review it. We wait until we have all the information that we need to make a good decision, then we bring it forward. And then we follow the same process that we've done traditionally. Prepare a term sheet at about the same time as they've got their zoning approvals, their preliminaries, and then approve a full contract when they have their final. We want to be careful that these two steps need to go hand in hand, but if they don't get their zoning approvals, the financing doesn't matter. But we also want to be careful that, if they have a financial need and there's no way we're going to approve it, well, then why would they pursue their zoning in the first place? So oftentimes it's a chicken and egg type of conversation, but those two steps need to happen at about the same time. And I think that's important to put in our policy. Two final things. Just a reminder that the City Council has all final decision-making authority. That could include a change to the policy, a waiver to the policy, updates to policy in the future. And then I've also added a statement in here about transparency. The city follows all state laws, all county laws. In fact, we go over and above. We provide an annual report each January to show in common language what we've done and what we intend to do. It's something that staff has seen as best practice. We're recommending we actually put that in writing in the policy. And then the final thing is an update to the fee. I mentioned the application fee for the developer is $2,000. Now that's in addition to all the third-party costs. The city hires lawyers and financial advisors and building inspectors to do all the TIF work on our behalf. That is all paid for by the developer up front, so the city's never at risk there. But as we've worked on more and more complex projects, the $2,000 application fee doesn't even come close to the number of days and weeks and months that Stephanie and I work on these projects. So we're recommending to increase that to 10, $5,000 up front to get through the term sheet and that initial review. If the project dies, then we're done. But if it keeps going, an additional $5,000 to do all the negotiations for the TIF contracts, for that TIF agreement. So it's a big jump, but we've not made a change there in 10 years. In the policy, in the red line, you'll see that in many of these points, there's an exception for affordable housing projects. And certainly that is something we want to be careful of. We want to make sure that we're delivering great projects, but every affordable housing development has their own set of financial challenges. So that might be one that you might have the power to waive some of those fees and other conditions. We want to be sensitive to that. But I think for every market rate project, these are, the last one I worked on was $85 million. The one after that was $250 million. I mean, for the amount of time that our staff is providing, I think we need a little bit of compensation to the city. So that's, in a nutshell, those are the policy updates we're recommending. Would love to hear your discussion and your direction. What I would hope to do is take your input, also work with staff to refine some of the language. I think there's some repetition in here. We haven't cleansed the whole thing yet, but come back to you later this year with the final update. The goal being to have it updated by December, maybe before that, depending on timing. With that, I'm happy to take your direction and questions.
Yeah, thanks for that good backgrounding. Commissioners have initial thoughts on some of the, I'll call it the red line document, the edited document. that is intended to embody the TIF increment financing or the tax increment financing policy. Commissioner Jackson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So thanks, Manager Neuendorf. This is really needed, and it's a great first crack at getting a lot of these issues I know that you've been wrestling with on a daily basis. So I can see the history in here as I go through it. I'm just going to make some big discussion points, but I do have some more detailed comments for you. First of all, in the general TIF definition, I think it would be useful for reading purposes to sort of say there's the state standard of public benefit, and then to define this exceptional public benefit as an Edina specific thing. So it's kind of, you've got those together, break them apart. And then also make sure that, obviously, we want the increase in property tax base. I don't think that needs to be included, because otherwise we wouldn't have an increment to finance off of. But yeah, if you could split that apart, that would be great. There are a number of places where we have sort of normative language, and to the extent that I've marked them, you can find definitions in state law or anything. I think that would be useful. I'm concerned that we don't get into a aesthetics type of discussion, because I know the League of Minnesota Cities really frowns on that, because you don't want to have the cluster of people who say this is what we want to look like, and limit people's property rights. So just to the extent we can get some, and like I said, I've marked those. Let's see. You answered my question about who has final authority. That was really good. Thank you. And then with both the environmental policy and the hiring minority and women-owned contractors, I direct you to, and I don't know if you have done this already, but talk to Heidi Lee and to Grace Hancock, see if they can find some industry standard language. I love the idea. I just want to make sure that when we word it, it's something that we know how it works. Let's see, again, with the small area plans, make sure that they're all included, not just the Southdale one. I don't think street rooms is something that every small area plan has. It's a great idea, but to kind of maybe, and it makes the document longer, but to use all the small area plans. And then one thing that is not in here, and Commissioner Anderson, I hope that you'll talk to the land value issue. I know that's something that you've raised in the past and sort of outside my expertise. But one thing that I'd like to see, if possible, and I take the input from my fellow commissioners, is responsibility to make sure that fair labor laws are followed in the course of things. So I know that they will be, but we want to make sure there's a point person to ensure that that happens. And that's something that's not in here. And I would like to see that. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
All right, good. Thanks for those good catches, good suggestions. Commissioner Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Neuendorf, I appreciate the time that's gone into this, and I view this as the first stage of tightening up, really, our TIF policy. So thanks for doing that. Just to establish a baseline, as people watch this and think about it, to establish a baseline beyond the fee differential, how would you say that the current proposed policy is different than our original policy?
Yeah, the key difference is that it's just a little bit more detailed. The current policy, it's about one page, and it has a couple bullet points that talk about the but-for test. So the existing policy says everything it's required to say, that it needs to say. But as we have more and more conversations with developers, we find it helpful from a negotiating perspective. If we can point to a written policy that says, no, your fees are limited, and if you want to hire the normal fee, fine, let's bring it to our elected officials, and if they want to authorize a higher fee for you, great, that's your authority. So having something in writing, because of course no developer wants to come up here and ask you to subsidize their profit, having it in writing is helpful for our negotiations. And our current policy is not that helpful from a day-to-day perspective.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I've had just a couple of, I guess, comments, especially as you get to minimum standards that are established. Commissioner Jackson touched on one. That would be number 4. That is relative to, let me pull this up. It's relative to superior design and finish. And as I mentioned, Commissioner Jackson touched base on that. And the question, the broader question to me becomes, how is that established? How do we do that? There are some communities who have pretty standardized architectural standards, others that have none. We don't really have architectural review here, and there's probably some reasons for that as we consider going into it. However, it's referenced, and so I don't necessarily expect an answer to that this morning, but it's a question that as we refine it and go forward is something that I would like some clarity on. Number 5, the affordable housing units and the guideline to provide units on site. That's a good idea, and I actually, Commissioner Pierce could confirm the final report from the Race and Equity Task Force, if I recall this correctly, was to essentially negate the possibility of an opt-out or buy-in option, if I recall that correctly. Yeah. So I agree with having the affordable housing units included. And actually, we're going to take a look at the affordable housing policy next, because frankly, I would like to see that all the time. I just think that the practice of the opt-out or buy-in option, it isn't delivering enough to replace the units that might be created, especially with the cost of construction where it is. That's another discussion. I just wanted to mention that. Construction mitigation. So we've all had quite a bit of communication on the project over on West 70th and 4040. And I just want to throw out here that the potential of giving guidance to neighborhoods as projects begin to impact any given neighborhood is something that I think that we should be giving some guidance on. And that could be included here in the TIF policy. The topic of inspections and sensitivity to inspections and concerns expressed about inspections, we can't provide inspections, but what we can do is make certain that there's an education effort made to those neighborhoods, and that we could, I suppose, assemble a group of inspectors, negotiate a fee of some kind if somebody chose to. Those are all things that I think we could do, and I would love to see that involved in construction mitigation. Commissioner Jackson referenced land values. To me, land values are market-based. That they don't really, almost all the TIF districts that we consider begin as market rate, almost all. And as a result, then the market is always going to more or less determine what those land values are going to be. There's lots of ways that we can determine those land values, but the prevalent one, at least in the commercial end of the industry, is to establish a cost per unit, the acquisition cost per unit. So if I'm going to put in 100 units or 150 units, I need to know that my site acquisition cost is at market. In a perfect world, we'd be a little bit under market. And what we find, and it's reflected in the HRA's decision over on the Grandview site, what we find at this time is that, especially in the first tier suburbs, we find that the site acquisition cost is roughly $30,000 per unit. It could be 28 or 29, it could be 31 or 32, but that's essentially what it is. Now that is also ongoing, and so there's always going to be changes. We may find in the next 2 years that those site acquisition prices could dip a little bit. We may find that we're at the peak in the last year or at least a year ago. We may find that there'll be some slight decline or at least plateauing. But that is something to keep in mind. I hope that answers your question on some level. Also, a couple things more. There's no reference to decertification here in the policy. And I think that would be important. And some determination about what occurs after the public benefit intended by creation of the TIF district is paid for. Do we allow that TIF district to remain open, or do we decertify and then move to redistribution of those funds, any additional increments that are held there on a timely basis? Question, I think that could be referenced. And then last, but I think maybe I'll hold that until we get further down the road. So I guess that's all I have for this morning. But again, I want to thank you for your hard work.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Anderson. Commissioner Pierce?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Bill, for all the work that you're doing in this space. So I've got a series of comments, and I feel like I'm kind of dropping the red ball. So I'm going to do that right in the middle there. I don't like that we use TIF. And so one of the questions I have, when we show that slide that has the 1%, what's the total dollar amount that we have in TIF? And you don't need to do that now, but I'd love to see that comparison versus the percentage. And so I tee it up that way because I do like using TIF when there's a benefit for it. And so I get that this is policy, but I don't think we should write the policy to encourage the use of TIF or write the policy to be neutral on the use of TIF. I think we should be writing a policy to do two things. One, limit the use of TIF, and two, be crystal clear what value we're getting when we do use TIF, when we do decide to use TIF. And I feel like just right off the bat in the policy, the policy says it's intended to provide guidance to developers, property owners, staff, community at large, regarding the use of TIF increment financing as a public financial tool to attract, support high-quality development, right, and so on. So if I'm a developer, if I read that, I don't think that sets the bar high enough for me as a developer to really do the due diligence. And you talked about it a little bit, the term sheet, but you actually gave the example of a developer wanting us to be the first money in. Like, I think our policies should be written so that they don't even think to do that, right? And so that's what I mean by when I say it should be written in a way to discourage or limit the use of TIF. I think it's a good tool, and we should use it, but we should use it in in your presentation. You say we use it, and it should be by exception only. Well, the policy should reference, right? When people read through this policy, it should be clear. Man, if I want to use TIF for this, that's going to be a high bar. But I fear what happens is we have this talk about filling the financial gap, and you said it today. Like, that kind of verbiage, I think, doesn't discourage. That actually encourages, in my opinion, developers to say, man, I've got this gap, right? All right, how big is that gap? Well, to close that gap, we can go apply for TIF. And I don't want developers to start with that. And you've heard me talk about grants. Right? I like the idea of requiring developers to use grants. But let me give you a couple of examples. And again, you have to take the feedback and see if any of this makes sense. Because my comments are all about framework and construct, right, to get to a certain outcome. And to me, it is the smart use of TIF is the way I'm thinking of it. And so two things. And I don't know if we can do this or not, but you'll get where I'm going when I give you these two examples. To say that I think you mentioned one of these, that you can apply for TIF, but it has to equal the value of the public benefit, right? So that's us saying to a developer, we want you to increase the boulevard here, or I like the sustainability. You talked about that a bit. We want you to have this level of sustainability in your project. And you know what? As a community, we will help fund that. And one of the ways we're going to do that is through TIF. Like that feels different to me. And so could be a way that we say we're going to limit the use by saying, yep, it can only be equal to, it's not 10% of the project, it can only be equal to what we establish as a public benefit for the public realm that we want to add into that project. So that is one example. The other could be an additive to that. You can apply for TIF, but it can't be more than the grants that you have sought, right? And say, okay, if you want so much TIF, you got to look for other sources, right, to close your gap. And you're not going to get any more TIF from us than other sources that you have done the effort to go apply for, to seek. And so things like that, when you put those things together, I think that pushes more of the onus on the developer to understand, now this certainly isn't free money. We don't view it as free money. And if you're going to apply for it, you have to do a lot of work to justify the use of it, because we would like to limit its use and be very specific in how it's going to be used. And so let's see. I mentioned the public realm also for affordable housing, right? That would be another way to think about that as well. And so I would love to have just that little bit more clarity around how difficult and I don't want to use the word difficult, how I'd love to see here, these are the standards, right? And be able to put our test to those to say, yeah, that does qualify as you're going to have to do exceptional work in order to earn this benefit. And that's the way I would love for this to read, that a developer understands that they have to earn the right to use TIF. And we're not thinking about, you've got a development gap, so what are these other sources we can use to close that gap? I'd love to see us get away from that kind of vernacular and really start to focus on limiting its use and being very specific on what value we're getting out of it. We hear all the time from some of our residents, we shouldn't use TIF at all, right? Developers should be happy to develop here, right? And I think everything is six of one, half dozen of the other. So there's probably some truth to that. But I do believe that this is a tool that we can use. But I'd like to see us have some verbiage in our policy that ensures that we're only using it on an exception basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Pierce. Well, I think our past behavior indicates that we've been cautious and prudent in the use of TIF. And maybe we can just say that at the beginning. You have a little background preamble introduction to the points that I think everybody sort of senses as to how we use it, but Commissioner Pierce has articulated how it's actually been used. And so let's just say that at the beginning, maybe have a little introductory sort of paragraph before you get to what I would call your kind of mission statement. And we've used that principle as we move along through the process of give to get on a PUD. What are we getting in return for what you want? And we've, most of the time, I think, applied that to TIF. And we've used TIF where we're trying to achieve a public benefit. And we've all got a common view of that being the sort of standard with a broad sort of application or definition of what that means. So maybe spell that out too, that it's all part of the give to get concept, and maybe express it in a more articulate way, that what we apply to the PUD applies to TIF as well. But then once you get to the TIF policy, I think you need to give us maximum flexibility as to how we use it in association with public benefit. So because I want to retain as much flexibility for the council as possible, because you cannot foresee all the factual circumstances that could evolve that cause you to want to head a certain direction. And somebody says, well, wait a minute, the TIF policy says these are the standards. So make sure that policy statement, that vision, adds language, I think, that we're going to try to achieve consistency with these things that we already use as tools, and that is the experience guidelines, that's our small area plans, that's our comprehensive plan. I mean, I think those should be called out right in the vision statement. And in the public benefits test or definition section, I would try to make sure that, and this is a language net, but I would say make sure that it says including but not necessarily limited to the following. And I would do that. Same thing. You had slide 5. You had some language in slide 5 that you don't have in the introductory mission or policy statement, and I thought that was pretty good broad language if you went back to slide 5. I didn't write it down, but yeah, the retained flexibility to address community goals, priorities, and economic conditions. It doesn't say anything about that in what you have for red line language in that introductory paragraph. I think that's good language.
Okay.
I think you should try to figure out how to add that in there, because that's what we're trying to achieve here. Same thing on minimum expectations. I think it should, be language that gives us a little bit of flexibility on moving if we have to. So that definition section on minimum expectations, we could say it includes but is not necessarily limited to the following. So that kind of language reinforces the idea that the decision eventually gets made here as to whether we're going to use it or not, and gives us maximum flexibility. So I think create language that supports that and bootstraps that ability of the council to make a decision that might be something we'd never foreseen. And that we're not stuck by the language of the policy once it's implemented that prevents us from doing something, or that someone argues prevents us from doing something. So those are my general comments too. Yes, Member Pierce, Commissioner Pierce.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The other thing I would encourage us to do is to really think about what actually happens every time a project comes before us that is using TIF. And we can show that slide that says we're 1% all day long. We can say it's by exception only. We don't use it very often, right? We do that same song and dance every time a project comes that has TIF in it. There's a reason why that happens. And what I am saying is, I think we need to dig into why is that happening. One reason is because people don't understand it, right? That's fair, right? But if every time that comes up, we have to go through the 6 things that say it's by exception only, we don't use it very often, we use it less than other cities. If we have to do that song and dance every project, to me that means that there's something wrong in the way we're communicating it and the way people understand it and the way the policy articulates how we use it. And so I am saying let's dig into that to see if there are ways that we can tweak this to just make it crystal clear, right, that it's not a free-for-all. We all know that. But there is something in the way that we've stood this up that does give the impression that gives an impression that is, in our opinion, not the truth in terms of how we apply TIF. But for some reason, it's internalized that way by a lot of our community. And so that really underscores what I'm trying to articulate when I use the examples that I used earlier.
This tool exists for a reason. You know, it's, and Member Fisher, when he was here, was good at articulating the reason that we wanted to make sure that fully developed cities like Edina could redevelop parts of their community and have the same level playing field as a city further out that had a lot of greenfield yet to develop. So, you know, some of that historical information may be valuable. What I don't want to see us do is get ourselves in a position where we can't exercise on a big dream. I mean, think of Centennial Lakes, where 15,000 people a day are using Centennial Lakes. Somebody could have easily argued that when they sold that gravel pit down there, that there was plenty of money available from developers to do what they wanted to do and not have that park. But we had a big vision back then in the 80s from the council and from the planning department that, hey, we could really do something special here if we use this tool. And so don't cut us off from the ability to dream big and have something that could unfold for us that is a delineator for our community that distinguishes us from other places. Commissioner Jackson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was thinking a smaller subset of that, you know, I guess I disagree with Commissioner Pierce on the matching the TIF amount to grants sought, because I think we want to maintain that Edina-specific, site-specific flexibilities. There may be something that our community wants that there are no grants available for that's really specific to what we're looking at, and so I guess I disagree with that limitation. Thank you.
Yeah, I would think a good example of that, I was thinking of that too, is that in the U.S. Bank development, we said we want this 6.6 acres cut up into streets and green space, and to get what we wanted there, we had to be a participant in the funding of it. And that's a good example of that, I think, where there was no grant that was going to provide the funding to achieve what we had for that gap, to fill that gap. So I think, you know, I'd like to have flexibility there too.
If I could just respond to that. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that we limit basis grants. So I'm going to restate this. My comments are to find a different construct that allows us to ensure that developers, one, know it's a heavy lift, right? They got to come in here and really justify the use. And there's got to be a way to do that, because I do think developers, by and large, think this is free money, right? I got a development gap and I'm going to use TIF as a source to close that. And there's nothing wrong necessarily with them thinking that way, but I want to make sure they come to the table and have fought through all these different ways. You've heard me ask developers, what grants have you applied for, right? Are you applying for grants? I've asked that a lot. And so what I am saying is, I'm not suggesting that we use that as a limit. I actually like Centennial Lakes as an example. There's a huge public benefit for that. I wasn't around then, but I use Centennial Lakes, and there's people walking around that lake all the time. And so in that case, if we use TIF for that, and we said, you know what, we want to use TIF to build this park, and there's going to be a huge public benefit for that, that would be great. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And then having developers do some work to figure out, are there other sources of funding that they can get? In the U.S. Bank example, I said, go back to your equity partners, see if they can, instead of taking a 7% or whatever their return is, take a little bit less if they want to get this done. All of that are things that I think would make a lot of sense for our policies to encourage developers to do, to be able to close their gaps.
Thank you for that.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just
Mr.
a
Director.
couple of things, and then I'm hoping we can move on to the housing piece of this, too. When you see grants, the subject of grants come in for development, I think it's important that you know that grants, for the most part, are coming to the city for a project, and they're not generated by the developer isn't bringing those grants into the project. But in fact, I'd say 90% of the time, Mr. Neuendorf's done 90% of the work, if not 100% of the work, to bring those state and federal grants into any project that we have here. So that's one thing to know. Second thing to know, we wish we could do more Centennial Lakes kind of developments, but those are expressly prohibited by law now. Somewhere in the 80s or 90s, the state changed what we could do with tax increment, and we're really limited now to a pretty short list of things. But in terms of public benefit, there's a lot of public benefit we can bring, but it's more in the way of infrastructure and less in the way of amenities.
Thanks for that. Others that cause any further comment? Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks.
All right. We're now going to move on to Stephanie Hawkinson, our Affordable Housing Development Manager, who has some notions on modification of our multifamily development affordable housing policy.
Yes, thank you. I will pull that up.
She's been good at scrutinizing this policy over the last couple of years and thinking about issues that she's facing that we need to have a conversation about.
Well, I think the previous discussion is a good segue, but also it's a little intimidating because this is so small compared to what you're just grappling with. I would like to say I am not covering today the issue of buy-in. We started this discussion last January at a work session, and we spent over an hour on the buy-in portion, and there are 3 pieces to the changes that were being proposed, and we ran out of time. So these are the other 2 changes that are being proposed. We're going to revisit the buy-in discussion, I believe, in a work session in January. So questions clearly can be fielded with regards to that, but I will not be covering it specifically today. So, here's some background, and I shared some of this with the City Council in July, that we have had this policy since 2015, and over time, almost annually, we've been tweaking it. We learn, we grow, we see what's the situation, what the shortcomings are, what needs to be buoyed, and so we've just made some changes over time. And I foresee that this is a live document, and as the city changes and as we grow more in the arena of affordable housing, and as the national economics change and everything else, we will probably continue to tweak and update this policy. So one of the tests that we use is we have agreed as a city to work towards the goal, the Met Council goal of creating 1,804 new affordable units. One tool we use to get to this number is this affordable housing policy. So these goals are for 2030, and I just wanted to reiterate where we're at now. And these are approved, not delivered, the numbers that I have in the third column. So of the 1804, we have approved 340 new units of affordable housing, so almost 19%. Where we have done the best towards this goal is in the 30 to 50% of AMI range, and I think that is completely tied to the affordable housing policy, where we say you can have 10% of your units at 50% of AMI or 20% of the units at 60% AMI, and from an economics perspective, it works better for them to do 10% at 50. And so I believe that is the reason why we're doing well in that row. One of the things that we have in our policy is, and this is not unique to Edina, is providing density bonuses. If you include affordable housing in your development, you will get a density bonus. However, there is a disconnect between the theory of offering density bonuses and our comprehensive plan and how we're zoned and how land is guided. We, in the comp plan, the table on the left is depending on how a parcel is zoned, and if I say something wrong, I'm not a planner. Carrie's back here to help me with the vernacular, in case I go way adrift. How an area is zoned, it's guided for certain density. And so for mixed use, it's between 12 units and 100 units per acre. It does not say if you include affordable housing, you can go to up to 110. It's the maximum is 100, whether or not the affordable housing units are included. And so and if we went up to 110, we'd need to go through a comprehensive plan amendment, which is a very long process. We'd have to, there'd be public hearings, we'd have to go to the Met Council to get it approved. And I think we are loath this time around to do comp plan amendments. I mean, I don't think we've done one since the recent comprehensive plan was approved. And I think there is some great resistance to doing so. And it would be a big push to get it to include affordable housing units. So instead, let's work with what we have within the comprehensive plan, and let's amend this concept of a bonus. So what we are proposing is that if a development is working towards maximizing the number of units that's allowed, that they have to include the affordable units within the development rather than opting for a buy-in. So right now, for example, in here, if it's high-density residential, and the density range in the comprehensive plan is 12 to 60 units. If it is a mixed-use development that's being proposed, they would need to include affordable units if they are proposing over 36 units per acre. If it's a residential development, not mixed use, and they are proposing at or greater of 48 units per acre, they would need to include the affordable units in the development rather than buying in. And so that's how the chart would go down. So anything greater than 50% of the maximum density amount in mixed use, and anything greater than 75% of the maximum density allowed in residential, then they would have to include the affordable units instead of doing buy-in. That is what's being proposed. So an example would be the density range is 50 to 100 units per acre. The proposal is 95 units per acre, so it's 90% of maximum. Then the development must include affordable units. If it's 70% of maximum in a residential development, they can choose buy-in, include whatever they want, with your approval, of course. So here's how this would have played out with projects that have been approved. So these are mixed-use developments. So the Onyx had 240 units. That was 53 units per acre. And per the comprehensive plan, they could have 75 units per acre. So it was 71% of maximum density. They would need to include. They're at 71%. It's a mixed use project, so they would have to include. So in the examples here, the Onyx, Lorient, and Nolan Mains would need to include the affordable units. And aside from the Onyx, the other ones did. And to be fair, the Onyx was developed at the beginning of the policy anyway. So we were negotiating with them. We got some buy-in, but that was at the very beginning of this policy. The Loden, Pentagon Village, and the U.S. Bank site would still have the option of including affordable units or buying in. So for the approved projects of the residential developments, the Aria, Avador, Bauer, Fred 1, and Perkins site would all need to include affordable units. The Bauer and Fred 1 opted for buy-in. If with the change in this policy, they wouldn't have the option. They would need, aside from getting a waiver from you all, they would need to include. The fallback would be to include the affordable units in those developments rather than doing buy-in. The Millennium and Edina Flats would still have the option of doing the buy-in. And in this case, Millennium did include a portion, not the 10%, it's 5% of affordable units, and Edina Flats did the buy-in. So that's how, if this change would have affected these developments. So it's not radical. It's not a huge change. Fred 1 probably would have caused a little bit more discussion on having them do buy-in rather than, or having them do the including the units rather than doing buy-in. So they would have had a higher hill to climb or convince you more if they're going to do buy-in rather than including the units. So that's the first change, is requiring the inclusion if they aim towards or work towards maximum density being requested. The second change, and this seems self-evident, is that if they are going to adhere to this policy and include affordable units in their development, that they need to cooperate and work with our third-party compliance officer. They can't just hang up the phone. They can't not invite them in to have a discussion. And when the compliance officer is trying to look at their files and figure out where there's going and help them achieve what they promised to achieve, that they have to cooperate. That is not necessarily the case, and so I want it to put in writing. And that's it. Much shorter presentation.
Questions, comments for Stephanie? Commissioner Jackson? I saw you lean into the microphone.
Oh, my jaw is dropping that people aren't working with a compliance officer. That just is, I'm very sorry to hear that. I'm just curious on a couple of things. One is, does this compare to any other cities around the nation in their affordable housing policy? I'm interested in the consequences. Are we going to see less dense housing proposed to do this, to comply with this? Or what cities, where did these ideas come from besides your own creative brain, which is always at work? But do we have any real life examples of what the effects of these types of policies have been?
Chair, Commissioner, other cities that I've seen and read their policies, they have the density bonus, which is why I think we had the density bonus. That if they can get a 10% bump in density if they include affordable units. And because of the way our comprehensive plan is written and because of the way our land use is guided, and without a comp plan amendment, we can't offer that bonus. They can get up to maximum density in the way it's written. Without including the affordable units. So that's how other cities do that, and so the fact that we had written density bonus was completely aligned with other communities. In practice, it doesn't work.
Okay, thank you.
And may I answer that second
Sure,
part of your
absolutely.
question? I'm sorry, I didn't. Developers, in my experience, and this is not 100% true, want maximum density because that's how they get their budgets to work. You know, there's fixed costs in a development. Land, to a certain extent architecture, that's kind of varies. Environmental studies, improvements, a lot of that are fixed costs. So the more units you have, those costs are split out amongst more units. And so projects become more economically achievable the denser they are. And so they have motivation to have higher density. So the fact of decreasing density to circumvent this rule, there are consequences on their bottom line for doing so.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Other questions, comments? Yes. Commissioner Anderson?
Thank you. A very small point question. On paragraph 4 in the proposed policy, it talks about one enclosed parking space included in any rental or sales unit. Okay, so, and then in jumping to paragraph 9, then we consider parking requirement reductions as an incentive as well. And I'm just wondering, do we have a conflict in the making there anywhere?
Chair, Commissioner, honestly, I need to look at that closely. One of the ideas is since this is an inclusionary policy, we didn't want the market rate renters to have luxury parking and the affordable renters to have to find someplace in the neighborhood to park, which isn't, on-street parking. And so it was trying to level the playing field so they're not treated like second-class citizens with regards to parking. With the changes in the parking requirements, let me take a look at that, and I'll come back and see if changes are needed.
Yeah, the new statute calls actually for, I think, up to 1.31, if I recall this, or 1.3. And there's no conflict with the statute relative to the provision in paragraph 4. I just throwing that out just so that might, it just needs some revision, that's all. But thank you for your answer. Then on paragraph 12, there's language to the effect of cooperation with the city's compliance officer, and you did touch base on it. I too am amazed that there would be lack of cooperation there. Something's askew, and that goes to the point of my question. Can you just expand a little bit? People are watching. And so if you can expand a little bit on the duties or the relationship, I guess, with the compliance officer. What does the compliance officer do, and what's that relationship to be with management companies?
Most definitely. Chair, Commissioners, we have contracted with Affordable Housing Connections to do our compliance verification. So initially, they will reach out to the property management, introduce themselves, I'm here to help you. Doing income verification of tenants for some of these property managers is a brand new world. They're not quite sure how to do that. How do you consider investments and income off of investments? How do you consider other assets? And so they walk them through some of these complicated, thorny questions about income verification. And then they want to make sure that the property manager has in fact collected everything other than I solemnly swear I earn less than X amount of dollars, so that they have it. They have backup documentation, bank statements, income, pay stubs, investment information, so they can confirm that what is being told to them is in fact accurate, which means the property manager has to collect that information. And market rate, they want to make sure that the renter has 2.5 times whatever the monthly rent is. So they want to make sure that there's a minimum income. With affordable housing, you want to make sure there's a maximum. So it's a different set of documents that need to be collected. So our compliance officer talks them through how to collect this information, what to gather, what kind of information is needed. If you don't have this type of document, then you can get this one instead. So just make sure that happens. And then also looks at what's included in rent. You know, are you charging them for utilities? Is the utilities included in the rent? Are you charging them for parking? Or is parking included in the rent? Are there other concierge fees that you're charging on top of rent? And to make sure that what the all-in for living in that apartment does not exceed our maximum rent requirement. And we have found, it's one property management in particular that caused this. I was like, it's not your business. No. We are going to give you a statement that we write saying we are in compliance, and that's what you get. And so won't let them look at the files. And when they move in, and then when a project is new, files for every affordable unit needs to be confirmed and verified. Then that happens every 3 years. In between years, it's some self-verification or on move-in or on turn. And most are like, fine, let's sit down, let's have this meeting, let's talk. And there's an outlier that is like, no.
Is there recourse on that basis?
I brought this particular issue to you all before, and because of the way our agreements were written at the time, there's no recourse. So we can't do anything about the past, but we can help tighten things up, belt and suspenders, as it were, moving forward, so it doesn't happen again.
Your answer is very, very helpful in terms of understanding the vetting process there. You probably go a little deeper on that, but it's another conversation, I believe. Do we have responsibility? Is there staff on a city level that provides this oversight beyond you?
Chair Commissioners, no, which is why we have, I mean, I'm a part of it, but some of it is very technical and very time consuming. And so that is why we have engaged Affordable Housing Connections, because they do compliance verification on tax credit projects, on home funded projects in multiple cities.
Thank you. Director Neal looks like he's ready to jump in on
They're
that.
very good. They're in this kind of subcontractor world. They're very good at it. They know what to look for. They know the right question to ask. They have the right parameters and standards. So we've had some good luck with them.
Thank you.
Commissioner Pierce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Couple questions, and again, thanks for all the work that you're doing in this space. For the, just to remind me, the 1804 comprehensive plan, that's our goal by 2030, 2040, 2030?
2030.
By 2030. Okay. Second question, in the density examples you gave on slides 7 and 8, I guess. Yeah, 6, 7, and 8. Those are still affordable units that are not sustainable, right? Don't they still convert to market rate after a certain period of time, or are they? Yeah,
Chair
explain
Commissioners,
that.
yes, that is in fact with the with all affordable housing.
Yeah.
In fact, in our policy, it's for 20 years that they have to remain affordable. With some projects, we're thinking the concept of NOAA will maybe kick in after 20 years. With 100% affordable projects, there are different, the funding mechanisms require different affordability periods.
Yeah, okay. And so I asked, thanks for that, I asked those questions because I'm going to make another comment. I have no issue with the policy changes. I do. I think some of those are good. However, I think when I read through it, like these steps to me feel like they are exceptions and they shouldn't be. So I think if we go through this, we still aren't going to get to 1804 by 2030. So this feels more like we go through this, we're going to incrementally add a few affordable housing units. That's what I mean. And so applying this policy is going to allow us to incrementally add. And that's what I mean when I say it's the exception. But we treat this like it's the rule, because it actually is. This is the only paradigm we have. And so I think that I just think we need to come up with a different paradigm, which would dictate either changes to this policy or new policy that would encourage us to be able to get more affordable housing in Edina that is not incremental in nature. And so the more I learn, and this is from Stephanie educating me, I know we're not going to talk about buy-in, but when I was on race and equity, we didn't like the fact that developers could choose to buy out. But, you know, as I've studied this and learned more, if there was another construct that a developer could choose to write a check for $5 million to buy out, and there was another fund that I could put that money into that could then go build affordable housing that's sustainable, that might change the game to me. I might think about that differently. But today there really isn't a big enough fund to do that. And so I know you're looking at other ways to try and accomplish this. Again, I don't have any issue with these changes, but I'm just encouraging us, we got to get to the dry erase board and figure out if there is another construct that will allow us to get sustainable, affordable housing and get more of it than these incremental changes. I'll make one more statement, and this isn't 100%, right? Nothing is 100% accurate. But I do feel like some developers, because of the way we approach this, in some instances, I feel like they do the affordable housing, but they really don't want to. Some of the developers don't really want to do it, but they do it anyway. And that, from a policy standpoint, is also not going to really help us get to where we need to be by 2030. And so trying to figure out how to write policies that encourage developers who actually do want to do this, bringing them into the community to now go build sustainable, affordable housing. I think we got to spin the flywheel a little bit more to try to figure out a way to make that happen. But I am in support of the changes in this current paradigm.
Thank you. I'm still not sure I understand the proposed change on paragraph 11 in the proposed editing. So it says in the first sentence that as allowing maximum density was intended to serve as a density bonus to the inclusion of affordable units for mixed unit developments that have density 50% or greater within the density range. Affordable units must be included in the development. And then your example down in A below, which appears to be a project that meets that definition, you haven't mandated it, but you've given them flexibility. So I'm just kind of confused by the language, and maybe there's some nuance in here I'm not grasping, but and then you go on to say for residential developments with density 75% or greater within the density range, affordable units must be included in the development, for example. And then you use B, if the proposed development is 88 to 100 units per acre, the development must include affordable units within the building.
May I add some clarity? Both those examples, A and B, are for the 75% or greater for 100% residential. So in A, 88 units, so would be the
Okay.
87 is the cutoff point.
All right.
For 75% of density. So if a residential project was in an area that was 50 to 100 units per acre, that was guided, and they had up to 87 units, they could choose. If they had 88 or more units, they would have to include the affordable units in there. So both those A and B pertain to the 75% ratio for a residential development.
Okay. I think this is really tricky work. I can't help but sit here and worry a little bit about, or think a little bit about what's happened in St. Paul with rent control. I mean, they've basically ground the Ford plant project to a halt. And so when I think about what we've been able to do with the buy-in money, I mean, to me, I don't think we would have had the Aon project. I don't think we would have been able to help with Elmonson Flats and the sound unless we would have had those funds available from the buy-in to help with those projects. So to me, the buy-in has had value. And to now mandate that the Bauer, for example, has to have their affordable units in the building instead of giving us $1.8 million or $2 million, whatever they did. It's a two-edged sword to me. It's something that I've got to really think that through, because I think it's tricky, really tricky when you start working the market a little bit too much. And so, you know, for me, the goals of the Met Council are precisely that. They're not mandates. They can't mandate that to us. They're goals. And they're laudable goals. And we've all tried to figure out ways to achieve them. When I first got on the council, it was just a bully pulpit, and we'd get a couple here, a couple there, and we're making some pretty good progress. Probably not the kind of progress we want to make, because housing affordability is unquestionably a global problem. So we're trying to figure out how to do it in our town. But I just want to make sure that in the process of doing it in our town, we don't screw ourselves up in the process in the broader sense of discouraging development. So that's what I got to think about. So I can't tell you that I agree with what you've proposed here yet. I just need to think about it some more. Okay. Anything else?
That's all we got for you today.
All right. Well, we're at the 9 o'clock hour, yeah. Anybody have anything for the good of the order? Executive Director, have any comments?
Nope. Nothing more today.
All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
We had a motion and second to adjourn the HRA meeting on September 15th, 2022. Any further discussion? All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. We stand adjourned.